Again, welcome. This is week 5 in our Summer Sunday series. Lots of S's. And this week our theme is fortitude, an old-fashioned word, fortitude. And we're taking our cue from the 5 lashings that we heard about, that Paul talked about in his message, in the message we heard earlier. It talked about him receiving 40 minus 1 lashings. In the law, they were not allowed to give over 40 lashings. So what they gave was 40 minus 1, just in case somebody miscounted. So if they miscounted, they gave 40 and they were still okay. And 5 times he received 40 minus 1 lashings. One of that amount of lashings could be enough to kill someone. He received it 5 times. So we're going to look at that. So first of all, fortitude. Fortitude. What is fortitude? I feel like a dictionary here. Fortitude is resilience, strength, forbearance, the ability to keep going even in the face of challenge, discouragement, and struggle. This is an English lesson for you Brazilians. That's what fortitude is. It's the courage to keep going even in adversity, and it is essential. If we do not have fortitude, if we do not have the ability to keep going when things get hard, then we will wither in the sun, we will be blown away in the storm. So, first of all, a little about me. I grew up a Catholic, and the stereotype of growing up Catholic is that it's gloomy and it's guilt-ridden and all the rest of it, and that wasn't my experience, not at all. But it was true that suffering was never that far from the surface. I remember my grandparents talking about martyrs. Some churches are called holy martyrs or English martyrs. That's the name of the Catholic Church in Biddulph, English martyrs. So this idea of suffering was there all the time. During some masses, the priest would use what's called the Roman canon. It's the longest Eucharistic prayer, and it's part of it is a whole list of names. 24 names. A canon is a list. 24 names of apostles and martyrs who the Roman Church remember. So they were everywhere, the martyrs, along with the confessors. The confessors are those who suffered for their faith or were tortured, but didn't get killed for it. So who suffered and were tortured, but weren't killed. Now, we don't talk much about them anymore. Martyrs, confessors, and yet there are people. They are our ancestors. They are our family. And I don't know about you, but when I gather with family, we often talk about family. So I want us to talk a little about these family members today. First, of course, we've got Stephen, the first Christian martyr, deacon from the church in Jerusalem. And his death is described in Acts when Paul stands there and they leave their cloaks at Paul's feet. And we even have Stephen's sermon that he preaches. On trial, he explains the gospel. He takes the opportunity of being on trial to explain what God has done through Jesus, the first martyr. One by one, all of the apostles were martyred. All except one. Anyone know which apostle was not martyred? It was John the beloved. He grew to be an old man. He wrote the gospel, and a legend has it that he lived in Ephesus in Turkey, and Mary lived with him. Jesus' mother Mary lived with him, the tradition says. Now, John in Ephesus gathered around him a church. One of his followers was a man called Polycarp. Polycarp went on to be a bishop in Smyrna, which is a city just 35 miles from Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. And Polycarp is seen as being the last living link with the apostles, the last person alive who spoke to the apostles, who heard the stories direct from them of what Jesus said and did. And Polycarp himself had followers, one of whom was a guy called Irenaeus. And Irenaeus wrote of when Polycarp was an old man and remembers of what Polycarp was like. This is what Irenaeus said: "I could tell you the place where the blessed Polycarp sat to preach the word of God." He was an old man by that stage. "It is still present to my mind with what authority he always came and went, the sanctity of his manner, the majesty of his countenance, and what holy exhortations he gave to the people. I seem to hear him now relate how he conversed with John and many others who had seen Jesus Christ, the words he had heard from their mouths. What a man that would have been to know. Now, 3 days before he was arrested, Polycarp had a dream. And in his dream, his pillow was ablaze. And when he woke, he turned to the people who were with him and he said, I must be burnt alive. It was like a vision from God of what was about to happen to him. 3 days later, he was arrested for not worshipping the emperor, which counted as atheism, and he was put on trial. And on trial, he, like Stephen, preached the gospel to the judge and to the court. He explained the gospel. And what he said to the judge was that he feared the judgment of God more than he feared the court he was standing before. And then he was condemned to death, taken out to be burned, an old man. And as he was being burned, he prayed out loud, praising God for the privilege of this opportunity to die for him. Incredible stuff. As I said, Irenaeus, one of Polycarp's disciples, also went on to become a martyr. He became a bishop in modern-day France, and he too was martyred. So many of the early Christians died for their faith. So many. Often thanking the judges who were condemning them to death for what they were allowing them to do. I mean, that takes something. You're condemned to die by the sword or by fire or by animals, and you preach the gospel to the judge and you thank him for this opportunity. These are our people. These are our family members. One early martyr, Ignatius, a first century bishop of Antioch in Turkey. You've heard of Antioch. It was where Christians were first called Christians, in Antioch. And he was a first century bishop from there. And like Paul, he traveled to Rome where he was martyred. And on the way he wrote letters. And in one of them he wrote, to make bread, the wheat must be ground. To make wine, the grapes must be crushed. So I want my body to be broken and ground by the beast's teeth to become a sacrifice to God. These were quite some people, these first believers who welcomed their martyrdom. And the thing is, the writers of the time saw this as essential to the preaching of the gospel. I find this really sobering. They saw the death of martyrs as key to the proclamation of the gospel. Because when people saw these martyrs die, lots of others were converted in the process. One early Christian writer, Tertullian, wrote, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. People would see these Christians. They would see the way they died praising God, full of joy, not condemning anyone, and they would ask questions. Who are these people? What is this faith that they are willing to even die for? And the church grew as a result. Here was something profoundly different. These were people not filled with the fear of death, but with the joy of life. And that is something. Martyrdom has never stopped. It's been estimated that there were more Christian martyrs in the 20th century than in all the preceding centuries. More Christian martyrs in the 20th century than all the preceding centuries combined. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German pastor and theologian who was hanged in a Nazi prison a week before the end of the Second World War, described the call to discipleship in this way. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Happy message, isn't it? This is not the kind of cheerful evangelistic talk you often hear, kind of, come and die, hey. But this was the early church. This was part of their message. And the passage we heard from Paul this morning, it's not a passage that we hear very often. It's not a very cheerful passage. It's not one that's often talked about or preached about. But it's important. Imagine the message we could preach based on this evangelistic message. Come, sign up. You'll have no money. You'll be hated. You'll be beaten and spat at and mocked. You might be tortured. You might be killed. But you'll be loved by God. And you will know God, and you'll be able to tell people the truth of God's love. And then they could also give everything up and be so challenged by seeing how you die that they start to ask questions too. How many would raise their hand? Yeah, that's for me. I want that. I don't think I would. Let me think about that. I'll get back to you in a very English way, knowing that means I'm never going to get back to you. But that was the message. And Jesus was clear on this as well. John 16, the end of Jesus' time when he's meeting for the last time, the Last Supper, with the apostles, with his disciples. And he says exactly the same thing. John 16, verses 2 to 4. He says, they will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they are offering a service to God. They will do such things because they have not known the Father or me. I've told you this so that when their time comes, you will remember that I warned you about them. Was he just talking to the apostles? Was he talking to the church as a whole? Later in that same discourse, that same passage in 1633, he says, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world, you will have trouble. In this world, you will have trouble, and that word means suffering. But take heart, I have overcome the world. You will have trouble. I have overcome the world. That was at the end of the ministry. But he does the same thing at the start. In Matthew 10, he says, this is right at the beginning of his ministry, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves, therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses, that's the Greek word martyrs, to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time you will be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to another. It's a kind of thread there in the Gospels that we often just kind of slightly, for some reason, overlook. Goodness knows why. But the call to follow Jesus can be summed up. You'll be thrown out of your communities, you will be killed. You will have trouble, but you will have peace. You'll be arrested, you'll be flogged, you'll be put on trial, but that will be your stage to proclaim the gospel of Jesus. You'll be betrayed by those you love, you'll be hated, you'll be chased from town to town, but you will be saved. Would we sign up? Let's look again at the reading that we had from Paul and see what he experienced and what he says. This is, in list form. These are the things in the reading that Jackie read to us from 2 Corinthians. Prison, flogging, exposure to death, 5 times being lashed 40 times minus 1, 3 times being beaten with rods, once pelted with stones, 3 times shipwrecked, floating at sea for a night and a day, always on the move, passing through dangerous rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in cities, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false believers, working hard, not sleeping, hungry, thirsty, cold, naked, weak, and tempted. I get the sense that Paul was keeping notes. I'm going to ask God about this. 5 times. 3 times beaten with rods. It's not like, oh no, it didn't matter. No, it's all for the good. No, he's counting everything that's happened to him. He's remembering every one of those lashes, I suspect. And when I read that passage, then The other passage, the one that we read briefly from last week, from Romans 8, suddenly seems to make a bit more sense. So Romans 8, bearing in mind all those things that Paul said he experienced, then we look at Romans chapter 8. If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It's God who justifies. Who then is the one who condemns? No one. Jesus Christ, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? These are the things that Paul encountered. And he says, no, none of those things will separate us from the love of God. So, it's an aspect of discipleship that's often been ignored or is ignored today. Historically, it was key. It's a call not just to face suffering, but to face suffering with fortitude, with the ability to still keep going. I think if I encountered one of those things that Paul encountered, I would think, great, I've done my bit. I'm now going home. Let somebody else do the rest. I've taken my fair share. Paul just keeps going. And thank goodness he did, because that's why we're here today. Now, for most of history, it's a very cheerful message today. For most of history, most people suffered most of the time. Amen. Now, as Melody said in the notices, we were out in the churchyard today, last week on Wednesday, and we were clearing the churchyard, tidying it up. And I don't want this to sound morbid, but I love churchyards. I love walking around, looking at the headstones, reading the names, thinking, who were these people? They're not just names, these were people with stories. What's their story? What was behind this? Who were they? And this churchyard tells a lot of stories. This church was built in 1828, and just 4 years later, 1832, there was an enormous cholera outbreak in Newcastle. And again in 1849, enormous cholera outbreak. 1849, the same year as the Irish famine was hitting its peak, cholera outbreak in Newcastle. And a lot of people in Newcastle died. It's there in the historical records. A lot of young people. Cholera in particular affects children, people who are weak, and there are a lot of graves in our churchyard, our graveyard, from that time. They died from polluted water. Suffering was commonplace. Now, there's one headstone in the churchyard that I love in particular above all others, and I've had trouble finding it recently, but I refound it during the week. We've got a grave of an RAF fighter from the war. I don't know if you've seen that. 1942, an RAF pilot is buried in our churchyard. And also this gravestone. Let's get the Margaret Beeland gravestone up. This, if you're looking for it, is under the holly tree in our churchyard. It's quite hard to read, and it's even harder now. I took this picture 4 years ago. That's harder to read now than it was then. But this is what it says. It's Margaret Beeland. She died in 1865 at the age of 58. It says, "Some have children, some have none. Here lies a mother of 21. That's a woman who suffered. 21 children. No wonder she died at 58, to be honest. 21, Margaret Beeland. That's a hero. It's interesting, if you look on the board of names of people who died in the First and Second World War, there's a Beeland on that board as well. I wonder, was that the great-grandson of Margaret Beeland? I don't know. But here lies a mother of 21. Now, you don't meet many mothers of 21 these days, and we tend not to suffer so much these days. Suffering, like talent or wealth or weight, is not evenly distributed. Some people suffer more, some suffer less. But most of us spend most of our life not really suffering. Think about all the illnesses you've had that if you'd had them in a previous era, you'd be walking with a stick now, or you'd have a kind of ongoing issue that now modern medicine has solved, and you don't even think about it. But most people live difficult, harsh lives. Mercy was in short supply. It was a dog-eat-dog world. Look after number one. Sickness is common. Death was daily. Execution, sadly, not unusual. So for most of history, the question has not been, will you suffer, but what are you willing to suffer for? What are you willing to embrace? If you're going to suffer, what are you willing to embrace in terms of suffering? And now suffering is kept at arm's distance from us, and we don't even think about it most of the time until it hits us full in the face. We don't develop that fortitude that is talked about in these passages. Where is the adversity that would strengthen us? Like resistance exercises. If you don't have that experience of suffering, how do you ever build fortitude? Now, as we said, there are still martyrs today. 6,000 people this year and last year, Open Doors reckon, will be killed for their Christian faith. 6,000 people. That's 16 a day, one every 90 minutes. So while we've been in this church, somebody in the world, a brother, a sister, has died for their faith, statistically on average. If we don't suffer for our faith, if we don't experience trouble, and yet Jesus said that we would, what's going on? Did he get it wrong? Or have we somehow got it wrong? There's something that's not quite adding up. So we have to ask ourselves, do we fit so comfortably into this world that we pose no challenge and no threat to this world? There's no need to silence someone who isn't saying anything. There's no need to stop someone who hasn't even started anything yet. Do we stand out so much that society must bat us down and shut us up? Not because we're trying to be offensive, but simply because we're being faithful. Or do we blend in so much? Oh, I didn't know you were a Christian. Somebody said that to me once, and that's the most shaming thing someone can say. Oh, I didn't know you were a Christian. So I must have really stood out. Didn't even notice you were a Christian. It's a challenge. I think it's pretty obvious now. If we lived real Christian lives, really loving people, speaking the truth, not going along with the way the world does things, but pointing to the kingdom, living by a different set of values, which stood contrary to the philosophies that underline our world today, we would stand out, and we would become thorns in the flesh of the world. Not because we're trying to, but because we'd be showing things up by contrast. And we would be hated. Christians are not hated. Christians are laughed at, mocked, ignored, easy to dismiss. But if we live like that, other people might start thinking, what is this Christian faith? What is this about? As happened to those martyrs. I find this really challenging, really challenging. Does God want us to suffer? No, he doesn't want us to suffer. But he knows this world is not in accord with his will. So he has the big picture. He knows that this world is not going to welcome people who live according to his way. The world's messed up. God is not fully recognized as king, and the world is going to resist him. But if we are so conformed to this world that we have no trouble in it, we've got to ask ourselves what's going on. Jesus warned that this world would hurt us, make us suffer if we followed him. If it doesn't, we've got to question, are we really following him? And I find that tricky and challenging. We might not be called to die, but we are called to be faithful. We're called to stand up and speak out. You cannot serve two masters. You can't please the world and please God. You have to choose one or the other. And that's what Paul is talking about. You know that famous passage where Paul says God works all things to the good of those who love him? Famous passage. That God will work all things to the good of those who love him. The context within which he is writing that is our present sufferings. It's not just a general kind of God will work everything out. It's when you are suffering, God will work it out. Not just suffering the way we all suffer, but suffering for your faith. God will work it out for the good. That's the context. So what is this suffering about? 2 Corinthians chapter 1, the same book that we heard from earlier, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 to 5. This is what Paul says. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion. Passion means suffering, by the way. Compassion means suffering with. So he's suffering with us. The Father of compassion and the God of all comfort. You notice it's got that word, fort in, strength, giving us strength. Who comforts us in all our troubles. Same word used in John 16. So that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. So we suffer so that God can comfort us, give us strength. And we in turn can then give strength to others who suffer. There's a process here. There's a kind of pouring out on us so we can pour out on others. There's a flow taking place. Our suffering helps us to identify with others who suffer. If we don't suffer, who are we identifying with? Those who don't suffer. We are then identifying with those who are comfortable, with those who are doing all right and have plenty. Are those the people that Jesus called us to live alongside? I'm calling you to go and live comfortable lives of plenty amongst those who are doing all right. That's not the gospel. The poor, the weak, the needy, the suffering, the prisoner, the orphan, the hungry, the thirsty, the blind, the lame, the ignored, the despised, the outcast. But we're living lives that are quite comfortable, thank you very much, doing all right. But those are the people we've been called to live alongside. If there were a job to be apostle to the comfortable, I would volunteer. I would like to be the evangelist to the comfortable, and I will live with the comfortable in a comfortable house, a mansion like them, and preach to them. I'd be first in the queue, and I suspect some of you would be behind me. And the queue to go and serve the poor and the needy and the orphan and the widow would probably be a little bit shorter. But that's what we're called to do. This world doesn't need comfortable, satisfied, safe Christians. This world needs wounded healers, learning teachers, humble leaders, those who know that life is not about climbing up, but about going to the bottom to help those who've been left behind. That's what the world needs. That's the job. That's the mission. So what do we do with all this? Do we then, right, I'm going to get myself ready, I'm going to steel myself, I'm going to suffer. No. What is how to attract people? Nobody's going to come, I want to hear what this person's got to say. Oh, it's all about suffering. The church has done that historically. The church has all been about, oh, life's miserable, life's suffering. No. We're to take Jesus as our model. Hebrews 12:2. He says, take Jesus as our model. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. Like those first martyrs, they were joyful in their suffering. James chapter 1, verse 2, he says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Consider it pure joy. I am challenged by that. Paul, we heard that long list of all the bad things he said happened to him. He carries on in 2 Corinthians 12 to talk about the good things that have happened. He talks about the difficulties that have taken place, but then he talks about amazing things. He says he's mad to boast of them. He says he's had visions, he's had revelations. He was taken up into the very highest heavens, hearing things that were too beautiful for any human to hear. That's the flip side of what he's talking about. There's troubles and there's blessings. And the niggling difficulties continued even in the blessings. And Paul prayed for those difficulties to be taken from him. You all know the passage. 2 Corinthians 12:9. He prays that the difficulties would stop, as we all would, and he feels God say to him, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." So what does Paul say? He's not saying we have to be strong. What he's saying is, don't be afraid to be weak. Embrace your weakness. Because your weakness in the topsy-turvy, upside-down order of the kingdom of God, your weakness is your greatest strength. Because it's through your weakness that God's grace is made perfect. So do not be afraid to be weak. Have you heard of the Japanese pottery craft of kintsugi? A few nods, a few shaken heads. Okay. It's a thing that kind of became well known more recently. What kintsugi is, you have these pots, these cups, and they smash. Wasted, to be thrown away. Or, what kintsugi does, let's get the picture up. They join the bowls back together using gold. And the most broken of bits of crockery become the most valuable. The worst become the best. The weakest becomes strong. What should be thrown away becomes the prized possession. I love that. Don't be afraid of your weakness, because what was weak will be made strong. What is broken will be made beautiful. The worst will become the best. You might know the singer Leonard Cohen. He has a song called Anthem, and he says, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. That's what Paul's talking about here. Don't be afraid to suffer. Don't be afraid to be weak, because there you'll find God's strength. So, what does this mean for us in 2023 in Newcastle under Lyme, besides wandering around graveyards? I find this a challenge to how I approach my faith, and I think it is a challenge. How do we approach church? Do we approach it as confessors who are willing to suffer, or as consumers who are coming to receive, to take, to benefit, to be personally fulfilled? The message of the gospel, the way it's presented often nowadays, is about what will be good for you, what will benefit you. And we come to church because we benefit from it. We're consuming. We grow up with consumption as the dominant philosophy we live within. That you choose, you take, you receive. When there's nothing left to receive, you then move on and receive somewhere else. You take from somewhere else. This is the philosophy of the world. But what happens when we find it hard? What then happens when we're not happy, when we feel misunderstood? There is no group of people on earth who will always be whistling their way through life together, arm in arm, skipping along with daisies threaded through their hair. If there is such a group, I've not yet come across them. We're not meant to be like that. We're meant to be real. We believers should be the most deeply real of all human beings. We're supposed to live lives that are deeply real. We're supposed to be people who do life together, who go deep together. If you go deep, there are frictions, there are niggles, there are difficulties and hassles. Of course, anyone who's married knows that. There will be those little bits where things rub and are difficult. But those moments are potentially the most honest, the most fruitful, the most real parts of our lives, where we're not wearing false smiles and fake masks, but we are real with each other, where there is forgiveness, reconciliation, fellowship, where instead of things fracturing and breaking, they become the most beautiful part. Where people have fallen out and then got back together, it's stronger than before. It's more beautiful than before. It's more blessed than before. There's nothing wrong with struggle and tussle and difficulty if we're willing to forgive, to move on, to be reconciled. That's where we stand out as different from the world. We've got to live differently. You know, if we try and avoid this struggle, you know the idea of you might have heard the chrysalis of a butterfly. Have you heard the story of the chrysalis? A butterfly surrounds itself with this chrysalis, and it breaks down and reforms, and then you see the chrysalis the butterfly's inside trying to get out of the chrysalis. You know the image? You've seen the image? It would be tempting to just open the chrysalis to let the butterfly out. What happens if you do that? Anyone know? The butterfly dies. It's not strong enough to survive. It's in the struggle within the chrysalis to get out that the butterfly's wings are strengthened to live and to fly. The struggle brings the life. So the challenge for us is, are we consumers of Christianity or confessors of Christ? Are we seeking individual fulfillment, or are we part of a body that is trying to live differently from the world according to different rules and different ways of doing things? I hope that it's the confessors, that we can be the confessors. If we don't just seek individual fulfillment, looking to be happy and fulfilled, but instead look for where the Spirit is calling us, what the Spirit is doing, and how we can fit in, then the church can make a difference. In any army, there's different people. There's some fighting, some drawing up plans, some providing rations, some putting up tents, drawing maps, medical care, training, negotiating, driving, digging, sewing uniforms together. Who's the most important there? All of them. If there's nobody sewing uniforms, those soldiers are going to go into battle naked. It might be frightening for someone. All of those people are needed together. We are currently, I think, in our society, in an alarm situation. Alarm, all arm, to arms. We are currently in that emergency situation. And if we're sitting in our comfortable lives thinking, well, I'm not sure that I'm really happy anymore, instead of thinking, where is the Spirit working and how can I join in with what's going on? Of course, the world's not going to say anything about us. It's going to ignore us. If we are one force together, working together, then we're going to meet resistance. And there's going to be suffering. So, summing up. It's tempting sometimes to want a comfortable, quiet life. I think everyone would like a quiet, comfortable life. I suspect Paul would have liked a quiet life. Was Paul disappointed by his suffering? Maybe. Was he confused by it? He doesn't seem to be. Did he enjoy it? No, I don't think so. Did he welcome it? Yes. He certainly welcomed it. Because he learned that the strength of God comes through the weakness, as did the martyrs. It was never their strength or their fortitude, you see. It was God in them, and that changes everything. So, in this world, you'll have troubles, Jesus said. But take heart, because he's defeated the world. And his strength is made perfect in our weakness. So don't be afraid of being weak. We need to stand up, stand out, speak out, not run, not hide, not keep things inside. We need to be honest with each other. It's good to say to another believer, I'm struggling. I don't understand what's going on. Help. I'm not okay. Those are good things to say to each other. Even if it costs, because that's where the glory is to be found. Like Paul said, there we will find things beyond telling of the beauty and the glory and the majesty and mercy of God. Stand with me as we gather all this together before God. Please stand with me. So Paul's going to lead us in a song, and we'll take this song as our response. And it's a challenge, really. Are we ready to give God everything? Everything. Not to be keeping the comfortable and the safe and the kind of upward mobility. Are we ready to give him everything, even if that means we will have troubles in this world? Let's take this song and think through the words as we're singing and do business with God in your heart.